If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Jonathan Callan, Kallan, asks, does the good doctor think it could be possible that there's actually nothing Jewish about the foundation of Christianity? And when the Jews recognized it was a complete fraud, the Romans decided to use it as a weapon against the Jews? The above is my theory after watching hours of Dr. Price, Dr. Carrier, David Fitzgerald, and Kenneth Humphreys.
So it was a non-Jewish mystery religion kind of a thing. And I wonder who he envisions Judaizing it. Like, how did it enter Judaism so that there was even a marginal sectarian Jewish Christian movement? And that's why I am more inclined to say that what you have is either a Jewish syncretistic assimilation of mystery religion stuff like Osiris, Attis, and so forth, and similar sacramental initiation religions based on the triumph of a dying and rising God, that they just borrowed it, which is not far-fetched to think, or that wherever they got the name Jesus from, it might have been a title or an epithet, that this was really a very ancient Hebrew version of the same thing. Just as we know from the Old Testament that they knew of dying and rising gods like Tammuz and Hadad Rimmon and so forth, that and Osiris, that they just started calling him Jesus for possibly because Yahashua means Yahweh is salvation, and if they understood him as being a theophany, an appearance of God among men, that could be an epithet. It would be similar to when in the Vedas they speak of a god called I can't believe I'm forgetting this. Rudra, who was a god of nature, and you had to be very careful with him because he was responsible for all the plagues and hurricanes and earthquakes and all that. But by the same token, he could give prosperity, and so you had to butter him up with sacrifices and praise and all that. Well, it appears that one of his epithets was Shiva, the auspicious one, the object of our hopes and so forth, and that he was known eventually as Rudra Shiva and finally just as Shiva, and perhaps because they thought his name was too holy to bandy around, or they were afraid to speak it, like speak of the devil and he'll appear. We don't know, but those are both well-known superstitious aspects of religion, and it could be that they just started referring to Jesus by an epithet, so it could be homegrown, another one in the same mold of these adjacent agricultural initiation religions, or it could have been borrowed lock, stock, and barrel at some point, and that almost doesn't matter, because if it were inherently Jewish, it would have been, again, the local version of a common thing. So it wouldn't have been borrowed, but it needn't have been borrowed. It would already have been in there, tied to the sacred king mythology and so on. How could it have been foisted or used as a weapon against Judaism by Rome if it had had nothing to do with Judaism? Because then you're really talking about something like Antiochus Epiphanes trying to impose Hellenistic Zeus worship on unwilling Jews, I don't see how. I don't see any reason to think that, and it does create a bigger problem than it solves.
That's interesting. From I'm probing on his question, he it sounds kind of a Roman provenance type of position. It's not that totality of Roman provenance here, but the idea that it would do that, could it work in a political sense rather than being a weapon? In a sense, it works politically, because the way I understand James Stephen Valiant, author of Creating Christ, is politics and religion they're inseparable in the ancient world. So technically, could it, instead of being a weapon, which we've heard Joseph Atwill, for example, kind of implements that it's not necessarily a weapon, but a satire in a negative way, kind of weapon-like, so to speak. Depends on what he's discussing, but could it be, instead of that, something truly of a religious significance, like you said with mystery schools, in a Jewish context, but also trying to syncretize, because of the Jewish customs that separated them from the rest of the world in such a way that they were almost like the lone wolves in a larger empire. The Romans said, hey, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, there's just constant issues going on between the Jews and the Romans. We need a new religion that conflates or harmonizes, syncretizes these two movements, or these two groups of people, Romans or Jews and others, so to speak. What do you think of that? And then technically, would it mean that it needed to be Jewish originally, or could it be a collaboration between both groups?
Well, that's much more trouble than you'd need to go to. It seems to me that really all they needed was to come up with something that would throw a wet blanket over zealotry, armed resistance, troublemakers, and so forth. And that's all that would require, was to try to come to some accord with Jews, which Pharisees and Sadducees both already practiced. I mean, they were accommodationists, and by that I don't mean quislings, as some people seem to think it means. They just were realists and said, look, we're going to get our butts kicked if we make the mistake of fighting Rome. We've done it before. Look what happens inevitably. Let's just render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. They're not trying to stop us from keeping our laws. In fact, Rome was pretty sympathetic and generous on that score. They recognized, because they thought that religions that even seemed kind of silly to them were to be respected if they were ancient, and they certainly, that's why they gave Jews exemption from the military, so they wouldn't have to fight on the Sabbath and things like that. They were very accommodating, and Josephus takes that approach, and everybody calls him a traitor. I think that's probably a bit extreme. He says, look, Vespasian, Titus, you wouldn't have had this problem if you didn't have these nuts like Judas of Galilee and Menachem and all these kooks who stirred up the people to a futile, bloody end. Well, yeah, there's no doubting that. Of course, he's right. And you couldn't say that the Pharisees and Sadducees were fake Jews or something. It's just Jews had lived under the government of foreign overlords for centuries, and they knew they weren't all bad. And it was sort of a moot point to say, well, yeah, but really we're waiting for King Messiah to come and kick their pagan butts, because it wasn't a pressing matter. If you had Jewish writers that could speak of Cyrus as God's Messiah, like in Isaiah, so I don't see the need for them to have gone that far. Again, I don't see how it would not be like Antiochus Epiphanes if you said, well, Jews, your religion is just too problematic. Why don't you forget about it and totally redesign it and so forth? Now, something like that had happened at the end of the Babylonian exile, when the sponsors of the reestablishment of the temple in Judaism were Persians, who basically sent Jewish representatives of the Persian government to basically impose Zoroastrianism. But they were able to do that in Jewish terms, and it didn't seem that discontinuous. I think the result was a long-standing schism between the Pharisees or Parsees, who embraced Zoroastrianism because they saw definite advantages in it theologically, like the idea of Satan as the real origin of sin. Well, that created problems, but that solved a big problem that they had had for a long time. How can God be in charge of this mess? And the resurrection, it was an attractive idea. And well, that would explain why we seem to be getting the worst part of the deal here. We're not delivered and all that. Well, maybe we will the next time. So there was a lot of attraction about that, and it was pretty easy to assimilate. It does look like that's what they're trying to do. And they said, for instance, that the prophet Zoroaster was actually Baruch, the assistant of Jeremiah. That's a heck of a claim, but rabbis made it. And because they're trying to get the two together, and they're not that incompatible. When you take, oh boy, I wish I'd have thought to mention that when we were talking about characters from other religions or mythologies borrowed. Well, in effect, that's what they did. They tried to say, oh, we're not listening to some foreign pagan like Balaam or something. No, it was Zoroaster, who was the assistant of Jeremiah. So he's got to be okay. That's pretty amazing. But you could do assimilation like that. And when Sadducees didn't buy any of that, and probably ridiculed the Parsees, the Pharisees, they just said, you guys are modernists. I don't know where you get this stuff. But, of course, the Pharisees were not telling anybody to stop sacrificing, not to circumcise their kids, nothing like that. So, again, you could coexist. And I just don't know that, is this questioner saying that Christianity was like a foreign imposition on Judaism?
It's the idea that is it possible, and he doesn't say is it the case, but is it possible there is actually nothing Jewish about the foundation of Christianity? So like you did go into the mystery schools, you touched on how it came out of mystery school ideas, but it wasn't just that it was mystery schools. It seems, was it originally possibly a pagan thing that got adopted by Jewish people? So technically, we've had this question before, and I hear a lot of scholars that have titled lectures, hour-long lectures, 2-hour-long lectures, when did Christianity actually begin? And they never really say when did, you got to define what you mean by Christianity at that time, because there's so much out there, even they recognize, even though you would separate hairs even further in terms of sects and different ideas that are going on that would maybe touch Christianity in a sense. They were brushing shoulders maybe. Was the foundation possibly not Jewish to begin with, then became Jewish? You're coming out with a book Re-Judaizing Jesus. Is it possible that the origins of this whole thing was a mystery school thing that had nothing to do with Judaism?
It is possible, but then you're talking about syncretism. How much could they borrow? And yeah, they could have, but I think that may be a superfluous theory in that they already had a Jewish dying and rising God, Yahweh himself. People in the mainstream like to ignore Geo Widengren, a Swedish scholar. The guy, his work is amazing. And all the data he brings up just ignored by most people, though nobody actually says he's a fraud or a nut. They just don't really give him any airplay. And so I don't know that you need to resort to that. That's in a sense a kind of a weird play on the apologetics idea that Judaism had a stable identity all the way through. Apologists then say, oh, you see, they never would have accepted borrowings from other religions, which they thought were completely false. Well, this is a sort of a similar thing, saying if there was a mixture between the two, who imposed it? Because that's what you would have to have done. It's not that clear. That like Paula Fredrickson in this Paul the Pagan's Apostle, she shows all kinds of interesting evidence that Jews didn't mind swearing out contracts and stuff, invoking pagan gods. They didn't care. Nobody was going to make a big stink of it. It was just the way you lived in a cosmopolitan society. And we have other stuff that like Jewish sarcophagus that has the menorah on it and the wheel of Attis's resurrection. They had what Rodney Stark called a diversified portfolio of salvation. I mean, even today, when mixed couples celebrate Christmaka and so on, that happens. I don't know that you would have needed to invade Judaism, but now another version of this is the view that I believe Frank Zindler and others have held, and it's an old view, that Christianity came out of a kind of Jewish Gnosticism in Alexandria that, for instance, said you need not keep the Torah commandments if you have a philosophical understanding of what they were trying to say morally. Philo came pretty close to that, but he wouldn't go past that. He said, oh, no, you got to keep those commandments, all the more since you now understand what they're about. Like I used to feel that way when I went to the Episcopal Church when they would have the Eucharist. It enhanced my reverence for it to think about its pre-Christian origins with the body and blood of Osiris and all that. That didn't negate it for me. It enhanced it. I said, this is part of a chain that reaches into remote antiquity. It was holier that way. So, so I felt like knowing what's really going on does enhance doing it. Doesn't mean you don't have to do it. Well, a great book by, I think, is one of the Dutch radical English disciples, I think it was Gordon Rylance, who wrote a book, The Origins of Gnostic Christianity. And by that, he means to throw in Paulinism and so forth. And he goes through stuff we read in the ancients about the Naasene sect, who said that Jesus, Adam, and Attis were the same person. And they spoke of a son of man who was a kind of a not quite incarnate visitation of the Logos and so forth. And there's similar stuff by the pound in Philo. So Zindler and Rylance and others said this started out as barely Jewish, but philosophized to the point where it doesn't sound much like it. And this eventually made its way to Galilee and or Jerusalem and got historicized with the aid of the Old Testament stories and all that. Well, that's pretty close to what this questioner is saying. But for it to be completely alien to Judaism and somehow invaded it or was superimposed on it, that's a little hard for me to imagine. Of course, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but there are less difficult explanations that still make good sense of the factors that are leading to this theory.